Thanks very much. Just to begin, I wanted to take a moment to extend our thoughts and prayers, of course, to everyone affected by the deadly earthquake in Cebu province that struck Cebu province on Tuesday. We of course are thinking of everyone there, and just wanted to mention that. All right, so our event today focuses on the risks faced by environmental human rights defenders in the Philippines, particularly those that fight for the rights of indigenous peoples. So according to Global Witness, which compiles a list of deaths and enforced disappearances of defenders fighting for indigenous people's rights or environmental rights. In 2024, according to the Global Witness Index, the Philippines was the deadliest place to be an environmental defender in Asia. 7 defenders were killed in the course of their work, and 1 person was disappeared and has yet to surface. Now, the Philippines passed a landmark anti-enforced disappearance or involuntary disappearance act in 2012, I'm sorry. And this was the first domestic law. So it was a landmark law in Asia. It was the first law that explicitly criminalized enforced disappearances as a distinct or autonomous offense. Enforced disappearances used to be linked to other offenses under grave human rights violations. This is the first time they were criminalized as a distinct offense. However, implementation of the law on the ground remains weak, and perpetrators are rarely held to account. We are familiar in this room, of course, with the notorious practice of red tagging in the Philippines, or the branding of organizations as either belonging to the Communist Party or as communist terrorists. The Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression highlighted this in particular during her visit to the Philippines in 2024. In particular, she highlighted the urgency or the urgent need of the abolishment of the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. This is a task force that has been creating lists of individuals that are perceived to be involved with a violent communism or with quick communism or with terrorism, and this task force has been behind the targeting of human rights defenders, indigenous persons, civil society organizations, and others carrying out their legitimate civil society work. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which reviewed the Philippines in February of this year, also has called for prompt investigations and full redress and reparations for victims of red tagging. This practice has had grave consequences, in particular for environmental human rights defenders who have faced threats, intimidation, surveillance, disappearances, or even death in the course of their work. The Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act of 2012 and the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, these two have been used to freeze the bank accounts of civil society groups. A recent example of that is CERNET. So this is a humanitarian group that was supporting 200 local organizations in the central Philippines, whose bank accounts were closed in 2024 and forced the suspension of all of its activities and all the activities of its partners. Indigenous communities, or those fighting for indigenous self-determination over ancestral domains where development or extractive projects are granted, are particularly vulnerable in this context. Now, here at the Human Rights Council, the UN Joint Program on the Philippines was created in July 2021 and was mandated with the training and capacity building of law enforcement, of the Department of Justice and other state actors in the Philippines, and with strengthening investigations into grave human rights violations, including cases of red tagging. Now, this program ended in 2024 and has been replaced by the government of the Philippines by an in-house program that they call Special Committee on Human Rights Coordination. A year after its creation, this committee has yet to engage meaningfully with civil society and with the National Human Rights Commission of the Philippines. The recently launched Philippines Human Rights Action Plan, this is the 4th action plan on the Philippines. It runs from 2024 to 2028 and was actually launched by the government of the Philippines earlier this year during the March session of the Council. Does not include a chapter on enforced disappearances and has no roadmap for enshrining in law the long overdue Human Rights Defenders Protection Act. Today, with our excellent group of panelists, we aim to connect these struggles. So the unfinished fight against enforced disappearances, the urgent need to protect environmental defenders and indigenous communities, and the larger call for stronger guarantees for human rights defenders. without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Valtimore Fenis on my left. So Valtimore, or Bong, as he likes to be known, has been working on peace and human rights related issues since the early 2000s. Bong hails from Mindanao in the Philippines. He is part of the non-Moro indigenous community that's situated within the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. He is a campaign officer of Sumpay, Mindanao, and active in peace, human rights, and food sovereignty campaigns. He's also a member of the Council of Leaders of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, or PAHRA. Over to you, Bong. Please go ahead.
Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. Yeah, I am Valtimore from the south of the Philippines. And yeah, in the Philippines, October is called to be a dedicated month for the indigenous peoples in the Philippines. After the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act was passed in 1997. Yeah, the month serves to be an occasion for the country, the government, and the agency, including the advocates, to particularly highlight issues and concerns of the indigenous peoples. But the lives and rights of the indigenous peoples, even with the passage of the law, has never been getting any better. Raid tagging or allegations to be members of local communist and or terrorist groups persist because for the indigenous people, they stand for the rights to ancestral domain, human rights against extractive projects. They were displaced and dispossessed, arrested, they were threatened, and worse, there were fatalities. For the indigenous peoples in the newly established Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, or BERMM, the indigenous people who ascribe themselves as non-Moro indigenous peoples are still highly vulnerable to human rights violations, like killings, mass evacuation, dislocations, the continuing land conflicts and land grabbing, political marginalization, which is very challenging. The indigenous people in the autonomous region recorded not less than 80 murders in 6 years. They strongly believe that these killings are closely related to the resistance from extractive and corporate interests over their ancestral domain and for their assertions to self-governance and ancestral domain as a whole. The latest fatality was just this past few days, September 30, 2025. Mr. Ramon Lopos was beheaded by armed men in that Hofer, Maguindanao del Sur, BRMM. He is the sixth victim in the said municipality within the third quarter of this year. In the long years of IPRA, or Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, it was only in the last quarter of 2024 that the regional law was passed for the indigenous people. It is quite encouraging, however, the implementation is actually a different story. Based on the decades of experience of the indigenous people upon the implementation of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of the defunct autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao. As stated above, or as I mentioned above, the Bangsamoro Indigenous Peoples Act, or the regional legislation and its implementing rules and regulation are now in place for implementation. But the squabbles within the new regional government, or the BERMM, affected the launch of the first regional election, and the Supreme Court just recently postponed the said election. For the indigenous people, this will surely affect the implementation of the said policy. It is noted that the leadership of the said Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao recently appointed a new minister for indigenous people without consultation to the indigenous peoples in the region. Moreover, an attempt to fully participate in the political exercise by registering an indigenous political party to the Commission on Election, it has never been realized. The COMELEC, or the Commission on Election in the Philippines, denied the application of the indigenous people's political party on the simple reason that the non-Moro indigenous peoples are not distributed into different municipalities in the provinces of the region. Further, 2 reserved seats are supposed to be in the Bangsamoro Parliament are supposed to be for the non-Moro indigenous peoples, or the indigenous peoples inside in the region. The problem, however, is the guidelines imposed by the Commission on Election and the autonomous region to select their representatives to the parliament. The COMELEC again ordered that it should be upon the sectoral parliament organizations and undermine the indigenous political structures to select their reserved seats or their representative to the parliament. With the entry of several development projects in the autonomous region, the land issue and conflicts are everywhere in the region. But if for the government or private use encounter the same problem, the ownership and tenurial issues a source of conflicts. Specifically, for the Tiduray and Lambangian ancestral domain claim, a commitment, however, no, it's a good development that there was this commitment from the National Commission on Indigenous People and the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs manifested to cooperate upon by signing the Memorandum of Agreement last February 2025. The timeline is 1 year, but upon the postponement of the election in the region is another question to delay or another reason to delay this processing of the ancestral domain. We appeal to the diplomatic community, no, to the international community to call out, no, the Philippine government or by any process it could be, and its institutions for the implementation of all the recommendations of the UN mechanisms reviews and enforce the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, observe the free, prior, and informed consent processes, and genuinely, and the Bangsamoro Indigenous Peoples Act and its implementing guidelines to guarantee IP rights, Indigenous Peoples' rights over their ancestral domain, justice and governance, and participation in governance in the region and the whole country. The international community also help or call out the government and line agencies to investigate and hold the perpetrators accountable and bring justice to all the killings and human rights violations caused against the IPHRDs and environmental human rights defenders, and eventually end all of these hostilities against the people. Also, we also appeal that the recognition of the indigenous people's political structures and systems should be recognized and respected in selecting leaders to the Parliament of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region and other mandatory representations. Also, we would like to appeal that the existing institutions and mechanisms in the national level and in the regional level would be strengthened, and the coordination of the national institutions, the regional institutions, and the national human rights institutions and the civil societies would be strengthened, and that the peace agreement implementation between the government and the Moro and the Muslim rebel groups must not sideline the non-Moro indigenous peoples or must not cause more violations against the enemy IPs, and their ancestral domain title must be awarded without delay, and the killings and abuses must be investigated. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bong, for your remarks. While Bong's remarks focused on the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, they apply across the Philippines. So indigenous communities that are fighting the creation of mineral reserves, mining, or other extractive operations expose themselves to great risk. Another community that the Philippine Association of Human Rights Advocates has worked with, so Manobo Kolungayon tribe in northern Mindanao, have been engaged in a decades-long legal battle for the recognition of their ancestral domain in the face of widespread displacement and leasing out of their lands to private entities for hydropower plants and palm oil plantation projects. So this is not an incident only in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, but can be broadened out to the rest of the Philippines as a whole. We turn now to Cecille Baello. So Cecille Baello is going to be speaking to us via a pre-recorded video statement. Cecille is the Deputy Secretary General of the Families of Victims of Involuntary Disappearance, FIND, in the Philippines. She leads the organization in its campaign and lobby activities, pushing for the strict implementation of the Anti-Enforced Disappearance Act and the Philippines' accession to the International Convention for the Protection for All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. Her work also involves helping raise awareness on enforced disappearance among the general public and gaining support in this cause through networking with from the local to the international level. Cecille joined FIND in 2022 as an advocate against enforced disappearances. A few months later, her partner, Bazo de Jesus, was forcibly disappeared. He remains disappeared today. Cecille takes strength from this experience to help nurture spaces for families of the disappeared, to never fail in honoring the memory of their disappeared loved ones and amplifying calls for the government to address this odious crime. We will now hear from Cecille.
Good day, everyone. I'm Cecille Baello from the Families of Victims of Involuntary Disappearance, and I speak today as someone whose loved one was forcibly disappeared. Jean Ross Hamil Bazu de Jesus was working for the Philippine Task Force for Indigenous Peoples' Rights when he was abducted on April 28, 2023 with companion Dexter Capuyan in Taytay, Rizal in the Philippines. Bazu is an Indigenous rights defender and has long been working with Indigenous communities to fight for their land rights and self-determination. Bazu is also my partner. As part of TFIP, he was tasked to increase the visibility of their campaigns on issues that involve the plight of Indigenous peoples in defending their land and natural resources. Prior to his disappearance, he helped in organizing the People's Cordillera Day in Metro Manila, a day observed to honor the life and martyrdom of Indigenous leader Macleing Dulag for opposing the Chico Dam project, which would endanger the land, life, and rights of his people. It was also a gathering in which many civil society organizations, particularly those working on the concerns of Indigenous peoples, came together with the objective of amplifying the voices of Indigenous groups from all over the country. Priority concerns and issues include the degradation of natural resources and the self-determination of Indigenous peoples in their fight for their ancestral domains. Bazu's birthday also falls on Cordillera Day, somehow a reminder that he was always meant to be part of the struggle he wholeheartedly chose to carry. Prior to working with TFIP, Bazu also led various campaigns for the welfare of indigenous peoples, which began during his days as a student activist in the University of the Philippines, Baguio in the Cordillera. From 2012 to 2016, he was part of anti-mining campaigns against mining companies Lepanto and Felix, as well as other concerns on development aggression in the region. As part of the National Union of Students in the Philippines, Bazu primarily forwarded concerns of the youth in the Cordillera region, highlighting how indigenous groups are not able to easily access basic social services, further putting them in the margins. As a student activist, Bazu also faced red tagging by state forces, both as an individual and as member of student organizations in the university. Hailing from the province of Bulacan in the Philippines, Bazu is not part of any indigenous group, but his involvement in various campaigns to uphold indigenous people's rights as a student in the Cordillera region is what made him aware of the struggles of indigenous peoples in the Philippines. Following his completion of his undergraduate degree, Bazu continued his work as a full-time Indigenous people's rights activist in the Cordillera, working in various provinces. Following his disappearance, we conducted an initial search in the detention facilities present in the region of Rizal. In the Taytay police station, an officer offhandedly stated that Bazu, along with companion Dexter Capuyan, upon learning of his work with TFIP, may have joined the Dumaga tribe, an indigenous group residing in the region. The officer implied this because of the group's involvement in protesting against the construction of the Kaliwa Dam, which will displace many indigenous communities in the area. Instead of providing assistance in the search, police officers assigned to the station only proceeded to harass Bazu's family by repeatedly asking for updates on the search and even attempting to visit their residence in Bulacan without prior consent. It has been more than 2 years since the enforced disappearance of Bazu and Dexter. This July 2025, the petitions of their families for the writ of amparo were granted. It's a legal victory, but it still doesn't immediately ensure accountability of the perpetrators, truth for the victims and families, and the surfacing of Bazu and Dexter. Every day we hope to receive news, to finally be told that they're finally found, but still we are left waiting in anguish, most days even in desperation. But we cling on to every bit of hope we could, just to survive, to continue to fight. The Philippines was cited in many reports as one of the most dangerous countries for environmental rights defenders. Along with Bazu and Dexter, other environmental and indigenous rights defenders have also been disappeared or killed, and many continue to be threatened in doing their work. Families of victims tirelessly clamor for truth and justice, but the culture of impunity continues to shield perpetrators, letting them escape accountability. We demand to put pressure on the Philippine government to strictly implement the Anti-Enforced Disappearance Act and to ratify the International Convention for the protection of all persons from enforced disappearance. Ultimately, there is a need to end impunity by holding state agents accountable and ensuring access to truth, justice, and reparation. No one deserves to be disappeared. No one deserves to have their loved ones forcibly taken away from them, counting on days and months and years for answers, holding on to nothing else but hope. We should all work together for a world where there is no more enforced disappearance. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Cecille for this statement, which is also a powerful personal testimony, of course. I think what we can all take from Cecille's intervention is that the longstanding reason given by the government of the Philippines for the non-ratification of the Convention on Enforced Disappearances, namely the existence and robust functioning of its own law, does not hold water in reality. If the government wants to show that it's serious about addressing enforced disappearances and offering accountability to victim and a real sense of hope, it should immediately ratify the convention. We turn now to Edgar Cabalitan Jr. on my right. Edgar is the Secretary General of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Associations, Advocates, or PAHRA, an organization dedicated to promoting and protecting human rights through collaboration with various sectors to uphold dignity and justice. From 2008 to 2024, he worked as a campaign advocate for the Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, TFDP, supporting efforts to assist political prisoners and document human rights violations. Continuing the organization's mission since its establishment in 1974 by the Association of Major Religious Superiors of the Philippines during the martial law era. He is an active member of Human Rights Online Philippines, a platform committed to advancing human rights through digital information resources, featured articles, news, urgent actions, and mobilization efforts. Over to you, Igor, please.
Hello. Yeah. Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. I am speaking in behalf of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, a nationwide alliance of human rights organizations, institutions, and advocates committed to the promotion, protection, and defense of human rights in the Philippines. The inputs presented, or I'm going to present here, is drawn from regular consultations with our members of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, different organizations and networks across different regions and sectors in the Philippines, reflecting the collective experiences and communities and defenders working on the ground. Human rights defenders in the Philippines continue to face heightened risk, despite the government's repeated pledges to uphold democracy and human rights. Since President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. assumed office in June 2022, official rhetoric has attempted to contrast the administration with the openly hostile approach of his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte. Yet, this change has largely been cosmetic. The same structures of impunity remain intact. Systemic violations persist, and civic space continues to shrink under restrictive laws and disinformation campaigns. For many, upholding human rights is not only an act of advocacy, but a matter of survival. Without resistance, repression becomes normalized. The motivation comes from both personal experience and collective conviction. Defenders are often victims themselves of systemic repression, whether as families of extrajudicial killing victims, Indigenous peoples facing land dispossession, or women and LGBTQI+ activists resisting discrimination. This conviction fuels movements that resist impunity and demand accountability, even at a great personal risk. Despite claims of the Marcos Jr. administration that the human rights situation in the Philippines has improved, civic space is increasingly under threat. The Anti-Terrorism Act and the operations of the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC, lie at the center of this hostile climate. Both have been weaponized to criminalize legitimate advocacy. HRDs and civil society organizations are routinely accused of being terrorists, a practice institutionalized through red tagging. This tactic delegitimizes their work and exposes them to harassment, surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and even killings. Despite a landmark Supreme Court ruling in 2024 declaring red tagging a threat to the rights to life, liberty, and security, the practice continues with impunity. The ruling has not deterred government officials or agencies from continuing red tagging practices, reinforcing the sense that HRDs cannot rely on state institutions for prosecution, for protection. At the same time, enforced disappearances remain a recurring threat. As of June 2025, the families of victims of involuntary disappearance confined documented 54 cases of enforced disappearance under Marcos Jr., demonstrating the failure of the state to implement the Anti-Enforced or Involuntary Disappearance Act of 2012. More than a decade since its passage, not one perpetrator has been held accountable, highlighting the entrenched impunity that emboldens further violations. Meanwhile, the government continues to downplay the urgency of legislating protections for HRDs during the February 2025 review of the Philippines by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or CESCR. A government representative claimed that over 400 legitimate CSOs consulted by the government expressed feeling safe and reported no harassment. This narrative starkly contrasts with the documentation gathered by civil society groups, which consistently report harassment, surveillance, and threats against defenders. Such statements expose the government's attempts to minimize the risk HRDs face, while undermining the push for the long-delayed Human Rights Defenders Protection Bill. The HRD bill has faced persistent opposition from NTF-ELCAC, which brands it as a threat to democracy. Central to its objections is the proposed creation of a Human Rights Defenders Protection Committee, which would include representatives from organizations such as PAHRA, Karapatan, Free Legal Assistance Group, and the National Union of People's Lawyers, or NUPL, all of which have been repeatedly red tagged by state actors. By framing HRD advocacy as subversive, authorities delegitimize defenders' calls for legal protection and use red tagging as justification for inaction. As the UN Joint Program UNGP on Human Rights concluded in July 2024, the Commission on Human Rights and CSOs called for its extension, citing its value as a platform for dialogue and accountability. Instead, the government established a special committee on human rights coordination under Administrative Order Number 22. This body, unlike the UNGP, excludes civil society from meaningful participation. Civil society groups have criticized this as a regressive move, raising doubts about the government's sincerity in engaging with stakeholders and reinforcing the exclusionary trend that leaves defenders without institutional channels for redress. The hostile environment is further evidenced by documented cases from PAHRA members. To cite an example is the Manobo Pulangian, which was mentioned already in Bukidnon. Displaced from their ancestral land for decades, the community has faced violent attacks whenever they attempted to return. Forced to live along public roads in makeshift shelters, some members have died due to harsh conditions. Community leaders and defenders continue to face harassment and legal cases. Sally Uhano, a women's rights advocate wrongfully convicted in 2021 based on fabricated charges, now 67 years old, going 68 this October. She remains in prison despite her case being bailable under established legal principles. Her prolonged detention represents the weaponization of the legal system against defenders. Pambansang Koalisyon ng Kababaihan ng Kalayunan is a national coalition for the women in rural areas, or PKKK. Their case in August 2024, wherein a staff of PKKK was red tagged when applying for a barangay permit. Authorities required police clearance based on claims that the organization was leftist. This represents how red tagging is institutionalized even at the local governance level. Samahan ng Mamamayan Zone 1 Tondo, SM Zoto, where in November 2024, two women community organizers faced harassment and intimidation. One was subjected to surveillance by an unidentified armed men, while another was taken from her home by soldiers, interrogated, and coerced into signing a waiver. These acts target grassroots organizing in urban poor communities resisting demolitions. Legion de la Cruz. In 2025, magsasaka party list is a farmer's party list or a peasant party list. Nominee Legion de la Cruz survived a police assassination attempt disguised as an arrest based on a decade-old case. This demonstrates how outdated or fabricated charges are used to justify violence and intimidation. Across these examples, red tagging emerges as a consistent and pervasive threat, whether through denial of permits, coercive interrogations, or online verification. The practice delegitimizes human rights work and exposes defenders to physical and legal attacks. These threats vary in intensity across organizations, but all members of the alliance experience some form of repression. Land and environmental defenders, particularly indigenous peoples in Barm and other contested areas, face the highest risk of violence and killings. Urban-based defenders more often confront surveillances, disinformation, or slap suits. The widespread use of restrictive legislation, including the Anti-Terrorism Act and the non-implementation of laws such as the Anti-Enforced Disappearance Act, compounds this risk. These cases exemplify broader patterns: the weaponization of legal tools, normalization of red tagging, and use of physical and psychological violence to silence dissent. They show that civic space in the Philippines is not only shrinking, but being actively undermined through violence, harassment, and criminalization. The lingering legacy of the war on drugs compounds this risk. While the current administration has promised a more humane approach, killings and arbitrary arrests continue, particularly in the impoverished communities. Accountability for the thousands of deaths under Duterte has not been advanced significantly. Despite substantial evidence implicating law enforcement officials and contractors, few cases have been filed, and impunity remains entrenched. Victims' families, however, have transformed their grief into resistance. Many have become HRDs themselves, turning mourning into advocacy through art therapy and storytelling that challenge stigma and reclaim narratives. At the same time, defenders have continued to press forward with efforts to protect rights. Some local governments have adopted HRD ordinances, creating limited but significant protection in the absence of national legislation. Beyond policy, HRDs have deepened public understanding of how rights are interconnected, how labor rights link to food security, or how drug-related killings intersect with poverty, corruption, and impunity. This holistic framing fosters solidarity among movements that might otherwise remain isolated. However, sustainability remains one of the biggest challenges for HRDs in the Philippines. Funding cuts over the past year have strained their capacity to maintain long-term projects because most funding available is short-term or project-based. Continuity is difficult. Defenders respond by pooling resources, combining activities, and establishing partnership. But these stopgap measures cannot substitute for the stability needed for long-term impact. Burnout is a growing concern, making care for carers an urgent but often underfunded need. Yeah. This situation, gathered by PAHRA and its nationwide members, converge on urgent priorities. Protecting HRDs requires dismantling structures of impunity, repealing or amending repressive laws like the Anti-Terror Act, ending red tagging, ensuring accountability for killings and disappearances, and enacting the long-delayed Human Rights Defenders Protection Bill. International solidarity remains vital, but it must be paired with sustained pressure on the Philippine government to align rhetoric with reality. Until concrete protection are secured and impunity is addressed, HRDs in the Philippines will continue to face threats to their lives and security. Their persistence, despite danger, reflects both courage and necessity. And its most fundamental level, defending human rights in the Philippines remains a matter of life and death. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Igai, for highlighting the risks and insecurity faced by human rights defenders. And we have to say here, it's important to note that these are continuing risks, despite the outwardly presentation of the current government as trying to separate itself or distance itself from the previous administration of former President Duterte. What we are seeing are continuing grave challenges for HRDs in the Philippines to be able to operate in a safe manner, and including also cases of enforced disappearances and other grave human rights violations that are continuing despite the government's rhetoric. Thanks very much, Igai. We turn now to Maria. Maria Solijani has wide experience in multilateral diplomacy, international relations, advocacy, and partnership within the European Union, the United Nations, and other international organizations and NGOs in Geneva. She served as senior advisor for human rights, humanitarian affairs, health, disarmament issues, and as a country representative for more than a decade. Currently, Maria works for the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH, as head of their Geneva office and UN representative. In this current capacity, she advises human rights defenders from all regions regarding different international advocacy initiatives. She continues to work on the promotion and protection of human rights, humanitarian affairs, conflict prevention, advocacy, and foreign policy. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, at FIDH, we are convinced that change must be rooted in the local realities of defenders. This is one of our core principles, and while the overall human rights situation in the Philippines remains extremely dire, we do in fact see some positive change in the local level. We welcome, among other positive initiatives, the Baguio City Human Rights Defenders Protection Ordinance, adopted earlier this year. It represents an important precedent for the recognition of human rights defenders at the local level. In fact, it explicitly recognizes defenders as an essential actor in a democratic society and establishes concrete protection mechanisms for them. But it is not sufficient. It should serve as both a model and a reminder of the urgent need to move forward with comprehensive national legislation to ensure that all defenders across the country can carry out their work in safety. As we have just heard, defenders face risks across the country, from harassment to arbitrary charges, enforced disappearances and killings. A consistent and comprehensive national framework is therefore needed, and it must be rooted in the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. From a FIDH perspective, several elements are essential. First, protection must focus on the act of defending rights, not on the formal status of the individual. Grassroots groups, social movements, and informal initiatives must be covered alongside NGOs. Second, no registration requirements. Some laws around the world only protect those who are registered with the authorities. Such requirement pose a great risk, creating indirect form of state control, excluding those who are not formally registered and exposing those who are to surveillance or reprisals. The law should establish the binding responsibility of the state to prevent and respond to attacks, threats, and reprisals against defenders. The law should contain special measures for indigenous, environmental, women, and community-based defenders who face greater risks, as mentioned very concretely by the previous speakers. It must guarantee that violations against defenders are investigated, perpetrators are prosecuted, and victims obtain redress. In addition, counter-terrorism and security and national security frameworks must never be used to criminalize defenders or restrict their rights. Finally, the law must provide a fully independent body to oversee implementation, receive complaints, recommend corrective measures, and report publicly with the participation of HRDs, including women and indigenous defenders. In addition, it is important to reflect on the role of the international community and the international and reflect on the role of the international human rights mechanisms in supporting the efforts towards such a national law. These mechanisms have already spoken. The adoption of the Human Rights Defenders Protection Law is both urgent and necessary. In March this year, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights urged the Philippines to expedite adoption of the bill to strengthen protections for defenders, journalists and lawyers, and to refrain from misusing the Anti-Terrorism Act. Equally important, at its UPR in 2022-2023, the Philippines accepted all 18 recommendations on protecting defenders. The government has therefore made pledges before the international community. However, it is now fundamental to follow progress closely. We, international NGOs, states, and other stakeholders must not only continue to urge the government for these commitments to be translated in practice, but especially ensure that the proposed legislation be a real tool for progress. To fulfill its obligation, the Philippines will still need to break down decades of impunity and abusive practices against HRDs, especially indigenous and environmental defenders. Implementation will require more than words. It will require institutions, business, and society at large to fundamentally change the way they treat human rights defenders. This is why international monitoring is essential. UN treaty bodies, the UPR, and the special procedures have provided a consistent roadmap, and we must now monitor that this roadmap is followed. Where national remedies fail, international accountability processes, including those undergoing at the ICC, remain crucial to ensure that past and ongoing violations do not go unanswered. To conclude, the Baello Ordinance is a sign of hope, but it must now be followed by comprehensive national legislation designed in line with international standards and effective implementation. FIDH stands ready to work with authorities, parliamentarians, and civil society to make that happen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maria, for highlighting progress at the local level and the key components that should exist in the Human Rights Defenders Act when it hopefully is passed in the not too distant future. Two points that I picked up. One, very important, what you mentioned, that irrespective of the status of the individual, protection should apply. So it should apply to human rights defenders that may be unattached to formal institutions as much as to formal civil society organizations. And also, of course, particularly key in the context of the discussion we're having here and the panelists that I'm sitting with is that any such law should contain special measures for those disproportionately impacted, in particular, environmental human rights defenders, women, and Indigenous persons. Passing on now to our final speaker. Ana Lorena Delgadillo is a Mexican human rights lawyer with over 20 years of experience in women's and migrants' rights, disappearances, femicides, criminal justice system, independence of the judiciary, militarization, and citizen security. Through her work with the public administration and civil society, Ana Lorena has contributed to law and policy, as well as a greater public recognition of the plight of victims of grave human rights violations in Mexico and Central America, related to impunity and the lack of rule of law. As investigator at the Mexico City Human Rights Commission, Ana Lorena promoted standards for comprehensive reparation, effective investigation, and the independence of expert services. She was also Deputy Attorney General in the Office for Attention to Victims of Mexico City. Ana Lorena is currently a member of the working group on involuntary and enforced disappearances. We are going to hear from Ana Lorena via pre-recorded video. She's appointed to the committee in 2023 and has been serving there since. Yeah. Thanks very much to Anna for highlighting the important work being carried out by the working group. In the case of the Philippines, of course, this is doubly important considering that this is the only avenue really for civil society organizations to be able to send in cases that the working group then could communicate to the government of the Philippines, since an official review by the Committee on Enforced Disappearances is not possible as the state party is not party to the convention as panelists have highlighted. I don't think we have too much time left for any questions from the floor, but maybe we can take one or two if there's any questions for the panelists. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for all the testimonies. It was very interesting to hear. I was wondering what mechanisms exist for families of those who fall victim to forced disappearances. Are there any mechanisms? Because you've mentioned the kind of lack of national frameworks or legislation, but I imagine that on the civil society level, there is a lot that goes on to support families. And is there anything that you see could be done on an international level to support those affected?
Thanks very much. Are there any other questions from the floor? Okay, Igai, I'll go to you for the question on enforced disappearances.
Besides the existing domestic law, which is the Enforced Disappearance Act, if I'm not mistaken, 10353, Republic Act that they private. There is also the Commission on Human Rights, which provides victims, especially the families of victims of enforced disappearances, their authorization or their capacity to unhampered visit to any detention or places of deprivation of liberties, camps, and yeah. So these mechanisms usually being maximized by families who are looking for their missing or their disappeared loved ones. Supposedly, it is also in place in at the local level. We have the Barangay Human Rights Action Plan. Barangay Human Rights Action Center. The PNP, in fact, has its Philippine National Police Human Rights Affairs Office. Even the AFP, they have their own Human Rights Affairs Office. I think they changed in a different name, but it's supposed to provide assistance also to victims, families, and complaints, and several others. Under the law, we have also writs that can be maximized by victims, like the writs of amparo, habeas corpus, what else? I think that's there are many laws and that can be maximized by victims, but the main problem now is the RA 1035 being implemented.
Sorry, we were told to wrap up by conference services. Just to mention here, maybe just quickly on Igai's point about civil society being able to visit places of detention. Many of the city ordinances that were mentioned by Maria also include that provision or that possibility. I just wanted to wrap up on a more positive note by maybe talking about the city ordinances. So in addition to the Baguio one that Maria mentioned, 7 other cities have passed ordinances at the local level, including Quezon City in Metro Manila. So of course, we hope that these can be an example for an eventual national Human Rights Defenders Protection Act that can ensure the protection and safety of human rights defenders across the Philippines as they carry out their crucial work. Big thank you to all of our wonderful panelists today here with us, and of course to all of you as well for attending. Thanks very much.